WorldComEDU. Elite Children's Classics.
The Happy Prince. High above the city, there was a statue of the Happy Prince. He stood on a tall pillar and was covered with leaves of pure gold. He had 2 blue sapphires for eyes, and there was a large red ruby decorating the top of his sword. Everyone admired him, and when children cried, their mothers would say, "Why can't you be like the Happy Prince? He never cries." One night, a little swallow flew over the city. His friends had already gone to Egypt 6 weeks before. He had stayed behind because he loved a pretty little flower. He thought she loved him too, because when he asked, "Do you love me?" she bowed in the wind. But after his friends left, the swallow felt lonely. He was getting tired of the flower because she couldn't talk to him. He said to himself, "I love to visit many places, but she can't travel with me." So he said goodbye to the little flower and started his journey to Egypt. All day long he flew, and that night he arrived in the city. He saw the statue on the tall pillar, and he landed just between the Happy Prince's feet. "This is a fine place to sleep, with lots of fresh air," he cried. "I have my own golden bedroom." And he put his head under his wing to go to sleep. But just then, a large drop of water fell on him. He was very surprised because there were no clouds in the sky, and the stars were twinkling brightly. It wasn't raining at all. Just then, another drop fell, and then another. The swallow looked up. And what did he see? Tears were running down the golden cheeks of the Happy Prince. His face was beautiful in the moonlight, and the little bird felt very sorry. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am the Happy Prince." "Well, if you are such a happy prince, why are you weeping? You have made me all wet." "When I was alive," answered the statue, "I didn't know what tears were. I lived in a beautiful palace, and all day long I played with my friends in the garden. At night, we danced in the great hall. There was a high wall all around the garden, but I never asked what was outside that wall. Everything around me was so lovely, and everyone called me the Happy Prince. That's how I lived. Now I'm dead, and they have put me up so high that I can see all the ugliness and sadness of the city. Although now my heart is made of hard lead, I can't help weeping." The swallow thought to himself, "What? Is it true that the prince is not solid gold?" But he was too polite to ask the prince about it. "Far away," continued the statue in a low, musical voice, "far away, in a little street, there is a poor house. Through the open window, I can see a tired woman sitting by a table. Her face is thin and pale, and her hands are red and rough, with painful holes where the needle pricked them. She is a seamstress, and she is embroidering hundreds of flowers on a gorgeous evening gown for one of the princesses to wear at a palace ball. Her little boy is lying in bed in the corner, and he is very ill. He has a fever, and he is crying. His mother has no money to buy him oranges. Swallow, little swallow, will you take the ruby from my sword and take it to her? My feet are fastened to the ground, and I cannot move. My friends are waiting for me in Egypt, pouted the little swallow. Swallow, little swallow, please stay with me one night and be my messenger. The boy is so thirsty, and the mother is so miserable. The swallow did not like boys very much, because sometimes they threw stones at him. But he said, "It is cold here, but I will stay for one night." "Thank you, little swallow," said the prince. So the swallow picked out the great ruby from the prince's sword, and he flew away with it over the roofs of the city. He passed by the palace, and he heard the sound of music. A pretty princess came out on the balcony with her prince. He wanted to talk of love, but she was thinking only about herself. "I hope my dress will be ready for the palace dance," she said. "I ordered flowers to be embroidered on it, but the seamstress is so lazy." At last, the swallow came to the pitiful house, and he hopped through the window. The mother had fallen asleep because she was so tired, so she didn't hear him when he laid the ruby on the table next to her. Then he flew gently around the little boy's bed and fanned his hot head with his wings. "Oh, how cool I feel," said the little boy. "Maybe I'm getting well." And he fell into a quiet sleep. Then the swallow flew back to the happy prince and told him what he had done. "It is strange," he said, "but I feel quite warm now, although the weather is very cold." "That is because you have done something good," said the prince. Then the little swallow fell asleep. Next day, the swallow flew to the river and had a bath. People were surprised to see a swallow in winter, and a famous professor wrote a long letter about it to the newspaper. The swallow was feeling very excited. "Tonight, I will go to Egypt," he said, and he sat for a long time on top of a church steeple. The little sparrows all said, "What a handsome visitor he is!" When the moon began to shine, the swallow flew back to the happy prince. "I've come to say goodbye, for I am starting for Egypt now." "Swallow, little swallow, will you stay with me one day longer?" "But my friends are waiting for me in Egypt." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, far away across the city, I see a young man in an attic. He is leaning over a desk covered with papers, and in a broken cup by his side is a bunch of dried-up violets. He has large, dreamy eyes, and he is trying to finish writing a play, but he is too cold to write anymore, for there is no fire, and he is very hungry." "I will stay with you one night longer," said the swallow. "Shall I take him another ruby?" "Alas, I have no more rubies now," said the prince. "My eyes are all that are left. They are made of sapphires, which were brought from India 1,000 years ago. Remove one of them and take it to him. He can sell it to a jeweler and buy firewood and food. Then he can finish his play." "Dear prince, I cannot take out your eye," said the swallow, and he began to weep. Swallow, little swallow, do as I tell you. So the swallow plucked out the prince's eye and flew to the attic. He entered the room through a hole in the roof. The young man had his head in his hands, so he didn't hear the bird's wings. When he looked up, he found the beautiful sapphire lying by the violets. "Oh, now I can finish my play," he cried joyfully, and he ran out to buy some food and some warm clothes and firewood. The next day, the swallow flew down to the sea to watch the sailors lifting big boxes out of ships. "I am going to Egypt," sang the swallow. That night, when the moon shone, he flew back to the happy prince. "I've come to say goodbye," he cried. "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince, "will you stay with me just one night longer?" "Oh, it's winter," answered the swallow, "and the snow will come soon. In Egypt, the sun is warm on the green palm trees, and my friends are building their nests. Dear prince, I must leave you, but I will never forget you. Next spring, I will bring back 2 beautiful jewels for you. The ruby will be redder than a rose, and the sapphire will be as blue as the great sea." The prince said sadly, "In the square, below, a little match girl is standing. She has dropped her matches, and they are spoiled. Her father will beat her if she doesn't bring home some money, and she is crying. She has no shoes or stockings, and she is blue with cold. Take my other eye and give it to her, so her father will not hurt her." "I will stay with you one night longer, but I cannot pluck out your eye. You would be completely blind." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, do as I say." So he plucked out the prince's other eye and flew down to the little girl. He slipped the jewel into her cold little hand, and she laughed with delight. "What a pretty piece of glass!" she exclaimed, and she ran home to show it to her father. The swallow came back to the prince, saying, "You are blind now, so I will stay with you always." "No, little swallow," said the poor prince. "You must go to Egypt to be with your friends." "I will stay with you always," insisted the swallow, and he slept at the prince's feet. All the next day he sat on the prince's shoulder and told him stories of things he had seen in strange lands. "Dear little swallow," said the prince, "you tell me of wonderful things, but the sadness of men and women is much more important. Fly over the city, little swallow, and tell me what you see there." So the swallow flew over the great city and saw the rich people in their magnificent houses, while the beggars sat at their gates. He saw starving children and 2 little boys lying under a bridge, trying to keep warm in each other's arms. A policeman shouted at them, "You cannot lie here!" And so they went out into the cold rain. Then he flew back and told the prince all he had seen. "I am covered with fine gold," said the prince. "You must take it off, piece by piece, and give it to the poor, So the swallow picked off the fine gold, leaf after leaf, until the happy prince looked homely and gray. Leaf after leaf of fine gold he took to the poor, and soon the children's faces grew rosier, and they laughed and played games. "We have bread now," they cried. Then the snow came, and the streets were bright as silver. Long crystal icicles hung down from the roofs. The poor swallow grew colder and colder, but he would not leave the prince because he loved him too much. He picked up breadcrumbs outside the baker's door, and he tried to keep warm by flapping his wings. But at last, he knew he was going to die. Slowly and painfully, he flew up to the prince's shoulder for the last time. "Goodbye, dear prince," he whispered. "I am glad that you are going to Egypt at last, little swallow," said the prince. "You have stayed too long here, but kiss me goodbye, because I love you." "I am not going to Egypt. I am going to the house of death." He kissed the happy prince on the lips, and he fell down dead at his feet. At that same moment, a loud crack sounded inside the statue as if something had been broken. It was the leaden heart of the prince, which had broken in two. Early next morning, the mayor of the city was walking in the square below. As he passed by, he looked up at the statue.
"Dear me, how shabby the happy prince looks," he said. "The ruby has fallen out of his sword. His eyes are gone, and he isn't gold any more. He looks like a beggar, and there is a dead bird at his feet. Birds are not allowed to die here."
So the mayor had a meeting to decide what to do with the metal in the statue.
"We must make another statue, of course," he said, "and it shall be a statue of me."
When the statue was sent to the factory to be melted down, the workmen said, "What a strange thing! This broken lead heart won't melt in the fire." So they threw it into the trash heap next to the dead swallow. One day, God said to his angels, "Find me the two most precious things in the city." And the angels brought back the leaden heart and the little dead bird. "Yes, you are right. These are the most precious things," said God. "And in my garden of paradise, this little bird shall always sing, and the prince shall be happy forever and ever." The Selfish Giant. Every afternoon, when the children were coming home from school, they liked to stop and play in the giant's garden. It was a lovely, large garden with soft green grass. Here and there, beautiful flowers stood in the grass like little stars. There were also 12 peach trees that had pretty pink blossoms in the spring and delicious fruit in the autumn. The birds sat on the trees and sang so sweetly that the children stopped their games to listen. "How happy we are!" they cried to each other. For 7 years the giant was absent, because he was visiting another giant far away. But after 7 years, the two friends finished their conversation, and the giant decided to return to his castle. When he arrived, he saw the children playing in his garden. "What are you doing here?" he shouted in a very rough voice, and the frightened children ran away. "My garden is my own garden," said the giant to himself, "and I won't allow anyone to play in it except myself." So he built a high wall all around the garden and put up a sign that said, "Keep out!" He was a very selfish giant. Now the poor children had no place to play. They tried to play in the road, but it was very dusty, and it was filled with hard stones. They didn't like it. When their lessons were over, they would walk sadly around the high wall, and they would talk about the garden inside. "Oh, how happy we were there," they sighed to each other. Then the spring came, and all over the country there were flowers and birds. But in the selfish giant's garden it was still winter. The birds didn't want to sing because there were no children. The trees didn't blossom, and when one little flower pushed her head above the ground and looked around, she saw the sign that said, "Keep out!" She was so sorry for the children that she slipped back into the ground and went to sleep again. The only ones who were happy were the snow and the ice and the frost. "Ha! Spring has forgotten this garden. Now we can live here all the year round." The snow covered the grass with a white blanket, and the frost painted the trees silver. They invited the north wind to join them, and he roared around the garden all day and night. The selfish giant sat by his castle window and looked out at his cold white garden. "I can't understand why spring is so late. I hope it will come soon," he said. But spring never came, and summer never came. Then autumn gave all the other gardens golden fruit, but she gave none to the giant's garden. "He's too selfish," she said. And so the snow and frost and north wind stayed in his garden. Early one morning, when the giant was still in bed, he heard some lovely music. It sounded so sweet, he thought, it must be some of the king's musicians passing by. He rushed to the window, but it was only a little bird singing in his garden. It sounded like the most beautiful music in the world to him, because he hadn't heard a bird singing in his garden for so long. Then the north wind stopped roaring, and a lovely perfume drifted in through his open window. The giant was very excited and cried, "I hope spring has come at last!" Suddenly, the giant saw a most wonderful sight. The children had found a little hole in the wall, and they had crept into the garden. They were sitting in the branches of all the trees, and the trees were so happy they had covered themselves with blossoms. The birds were happy too, and they were chirping with delight. Even the flowers were peeping through the grass and laughing. The giant stared at the lovely scene. But then in the farthest corner, he saw that it was still winter. A little boy was standing in that corner, and he was so small he couldn't reach the branches of the tree. He kept walking around the tree and crying. The tree bent its branches way down, but still the child was too tiny to climb up. Suddenly, the giant felt very sorry. "How selfish I have been," he said. "Now I know why the spring wouldn't come here.
I will put the poor little boy on top of the tree, and then I'll knock down the wall. My garden will be the children's playground forever and ever."
So he opened the front door and quietly went into the garden. When the children saw him, they all ran away, and the garden became winter again. The little boy didn't see the giant coming, because his eyes were full of tears. The giant gently picked him up and put him in the tree. Suddenly, the tree was covered with blossoms, and the birds came back to sing. The little boy threw his arms around the giant's neck and kissed him. When the other children saw that the giant wasn't wicked anymore, they ran back into the garden, and spring came with them.
"It is your garden now, little children,"
said the giant, and he took a big axe and knocked down the wall. Later, when people passed on their way to market, they saw the giant playing with the children in the most beautiful garden they had ever seen. All day long they played, and in the evening they said goodbye to the giant. The giant loved the tiny boy best because he had kissed him, so he asked the children,
"Where is your little friend, the boy I put in the tree?"
"We don't know," they answered. "He has gone away."
"Please, tell him to come back,"
said the giant, but the children didn't know where he lived, and they had never seen him before that day. This made the giant very sad. Every afternoon, the children played with the giant, and he was very kind to them all. However, the giant longed for his little friend, and he often talked about him, but he never came again. Many years went by, and the giant grew very old and weak. He sat in a big armchair, watching the children and enjoying his garden, although he couldn't move around anymore.
"I have many beautiful flowers," he said, "but the children are my most beautiful flowers."
One winter morning, the giant looked out of his window. He didn't hate winter now, because he knew that the flowers were only sleeping. On this morning, he rubbed his eyes in surprise. What a wonderful sight! In the farthest corner of the garden was a tree covered with white blossoms. Its branches were golden, and its fruit was silver. Underneath the tree stood the little boy he loved. The giant felt great joy, and he slowly went down his stairs and into the garden. When he came close to the child, his face became red with anger.
"Who has hurt you?"
he roared, for there were 2 nail holes in the child's hands and 2 more in his little feet.
"Who has hurt you?"
cried the giant again.
"Tell me, and I will take my sword and kill him."
"No," answered the child quietly. "These are the wounds of love." The giant suddenly felt very strange, and he knelt before the child and asked softly, "Who are you?" The child smiled at the giant. "You let me play in your garden once, so today you shall come with me to my garden, which is in paradise." That afternoon, when the children ran into the garden to play, they found the giant lying under the tree in the farthest corner. He was dead, but he was completely covered with white blossoms.